The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
Tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanoes. These are the sorts of natural disasters movies are made from, because throughout history we've learned that natural disasters often become human disasters. And as tragic as they are, there's often nothing we can do but pick up the pieces and rebuild, then wait for the next one with crossed fingers. Or is there? How much are we contributing to the scale of the human toll of natural disasters when they hit? How much do our decisions about where to build and what to build and how to build impact the cost? Natural disasters are an inevitability of life on Earth. They will happen. But how do our actions make the toll paid better? Or maybe much worse than it has to be? Hello and welcome to Science for the People. I'm Rochelle Saunders. With me is Robert Muir-Wood. He works on modeling the risk from disasters and working to identify how disaster risks can be managed and reduced. He has more than 25 years of experience working around the world on the risks from flood, hurricanes, storms, earthquakes, and tsunamis. He's the head of research for the world's largest catastrophe risk modeling company, Risk Management Solutions. And he's here with me today to talk about his most recent book, The Cure for Catastrophe: How We Can Stop Manufacturing Natural Disasters. Robert, welcome to Science for the People.
Thank you, and I look forward to our conversation.
So early on in the introduction, you say, I first became intrigued by the forensics of disasters while working as the science writer on a Royal Geographical Society expedition to the Karakoram Mountains of northern Pakistan. And that term, forensics of disasters, really caught me. Is that just a term you use, or is that a common term?
Yeah, and I think this is a term which I use to explain this interface between science and disasters, how we can make sense of what causes disasters, how we can learn to take action which will reduce the consequences of disasters. And I mean, disasters in the past, in particular, there may be limited amounts of information about them. So there is a sense that you need some forensics to try and understand what really has happened, what has actually occurred, why it happened, why were certain people impacted, other people left unscathed. So all of that, I think, it's rather like trying to solve a crime. It's from the limited information that is available to make sense of actually what has happened.
We do tend to think of natural disasters as these unavoidable big things that happen to us or that happen to the world that are out of our control. But the idea of forensics here kind of, I find, pushes up against that idea in my brain. It suggests that there are causes, or at least partial causes, that are within our control and that we should figure out what they are.
Yes. I mean, the subtitle of this book, The Cure for Catastrophe, the subtitle is How We Can Stop Manufacturing Natural Disasters. And that is intentionally a provocative statement, if you like, but it's trying to show that actually we know enough now to be able to anticipate a lot of the disasters which have the potential for happening. And with that knowledge, we are in a position where we can take action to significantly reduce the consequences. And a lot of the time when you look at what has happened in a big disaster and you identify, well, why did those buildings fall down? Why were people in the path of the hurricane storm surge? It's because of decisions that were taken around where people build, how people build, which were often taken naive about the risks that existed and that could have been foreseen. I mean, increasingly the idea that a disaster is something that occurs out of the blue. In 99 out of 100 times, that's not the case. It's something which actually we could have anticipated if we had focused on asking the right questions.
Yeah, there definitely is this tension of there's a thing in the world we can't control. Obviously, we can't control when and where an earthquake happens, but we can control a lot of stuff, such as where we decide to build things or how we decide to build things.
Yes, I mean, absolutely, and it makes a huge difference. I mean, if we look at earthquakes, which might be very much the same size, I mean, in recent years, an example is the earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2011, and the earthquake of a similar magnitude 6 to magnitude 7 size in Haiti in 2010. And the Haiti earthquake, I mean, we don't really know how many people died, but there are estimates up to 250,000 people killed in that. And in New Zealand, it was I think around 100, and even those casualties were largely caused by just the collapse of two badly built 1960s buildings. So there's a huge opportunity with the right decisions around what to build, where to build. We can make an enormous difference in the outcome of disasters if we can apply that knowledge effectively.
Something that I hadn't really thought about before, but now after reading your book makes perfect sense, is that after some kind of disaster, like an earthquake or a flood, there's obviously some science that gets done. I'm assuming scientists sort of descend upon the location to try and learn what they can learn, both about the natural part of the event, so the earthquake, the flood, but also what kinds of lessons learned can we take from how we built things or the structures that were in place, or just what happened at the time that we can maybe try and mitigate for future catastrophes.
Yes, I mean, this is all part of the forensics, if you like. It's actually, scientists, engineers will come in the aftermath of a disaster to try and see what can be learned from it. And it's always quite difficult. Things are very chaotic. It may be very hard to travel around, but there is the opportunity to see at first hand, to learn from it. Increasingly, that learning is a repeat of what has probably been learned from previous events. I mean, what we learned from the latest earthquake in Mexico, for example, may be very similar to what we already had learned from an earthquake 30 or 40 years ago. It's sort of, the lessons, they're often not new. Sometimes we are testing new kinds of buildings that have been built in the past 20 or 30 years, but often it's the older structures which were built without engineers, for example, which proved to be most dangerous, and this field work that takes place. It's an important part of the learning process. I think it's really important part of for a young engineer or young hazard scientist going and seeing what has happened in a significant disaster is incredibly instructive. It's a really important part of the learning process. You discover things which you would never have thought were significant unless you had been there. It's also becoming a bit of a challenge now that actually so many people want to turn up after a disaster, and there is a sense that actually this is not appropriate. This is getting slightly out of control, and I'm not quite sure how we do control it, but it is still a fundamental component of how we learn, and is from this learning, from this science, that actually we can take actions which will reduce the consequences of future disasters.
It must be quite a thing as an engineer to walk into a space like that after an earthquake and see the result of something that maybe you might have built, and how it was either able to withstand that kind of natural disaster or maybe how it didn't and how exactly it failed. That must be really both a difficult thing, a fascinating thing, a really instructive thing for, in particular, engineers to look at.
Yes, it's all of those. As I say, it's a really powerful lesson, and you will be surprised by things. One addition to our knowledge, which has just been coming through in the last few years, is actually what a disaster actually feels like live. We've up until a few years ago, everything we learn about disasters has come. In the immediate aftermath, has come from a television film crew will turn up, and they'll typically turn up 12 hours or 24 hours after the earthquake has hit, and so you're seeing a situation which people are coping to different degrees. There'll be some rescue going on, but you'll see things quite far removed from actually what happens in a disaster itself. And we now have mobile phone footage of what it's like to actually be in the midst of the earthquake or the hurricane itself. I mean, there was, for example, in Mexico last year, there was footage of buildings actually falling down, of people rushing out into the street and then turning their cell phone cameras on, and actually a building was shuddering and then fell. And I think that is another layer of additional knowledge which we simply haven't had. I mean, unless you've actually been through a disaster yourself, you will never have seen a building fall down. Now we have really interesting and important and real-time information on it, or of actually what that is like, how buildings do collapse.
So I want to talk about some of the specific kinds of catastrophes we face, and in particular, which is a topic you return to regularly in the book, how some of the decisions we make as people, how the policies we put in place, how sometimes our decisions to build in certain places and in certain ways can impact how severe those catastrophes can be from our perspective. So I think probably one of the best places to start is in the same place you start in the book, which is talking about tsunamis and floods, and in particular, our confidence in walls.
Yes. Well, I mean, I deliberately started with this topic about building a wall to protect us against flooding, because it highlights why this is not as straightforward as it might seem to offer protection to people. And you might think, a flood wall is a simple thing; it'll save us from floods. But actually, one challenge with a flood wall is that if you build one, people will assume that actually it is going to give them protection, and actually the decision about how high to make that wall or how strong to make that wall will have been taken as a result of available knowledge, some trade-offs of the cost of building the wall with how high to make it. And the two examples which I fold together, one of Hurricane Katrina and New Orleans, and the other of the situation on the Pacific coast of Japan. In both cases, government agencies built walls, and people, many people assumed that the wall would protect them. And the situation in Katrina was that a lot of people stayed in the city of New Orleans, even after they'd been told they should evacuate. They stayed because they assumed that actually nothing was going to happen. And in fact, as we know, the city was flooded. Around 1,500 people died as a result of the flooding because they were trapped in single-story houses. They couldn't escape through the roof. And if you ask, well, why were the flood walls built to the height they were? It was a set of human decisions, some trade-offs around cost and actually how high they should be. And we had the situation in Japan in 2011, which was even more impactful in terms of the loss of life, where the government had actually built tsunami walls along for the principal towns along the Pacific coast of Japan. And again, when the question came, well, how high should they build the tsunami walls? They simply looked at actually how high some previous tsunamis had been along this coastline and made a judgment about, if you build them 5 meters high, that should be good enough. But then a lot of people had come to live behind the tsunami walls, assuming they offered complete protection. And we had the situation in the 2011 earthquake and tsunami that the tsunami actually came in about twice the height of the walls in a number of towns. And as a result, around 20,000 people died, many of them because they had not evacuated. They had about 20 or 25 minutes between when the earthquake came and when the tsunami arrived. So most of those people could have evacuated. They chose not to because they assumed they would be protected. And you have a situation where if there had been no tsunami walls, and an example is the coast of Chile, where they also have big tsunamis, there are no tsunami walls along the coast of Chile. Everybody knows if you feel a strong earthquake, you get out of your house and you run up the cliff path as fast as you can. So having walls actually increased the number of people who died, in fact, as a result, simply because they assumed they were going to be protected.
So it sounds like walls sort of do two things. One is it seems like it encourages people to build in those areas where if there weren't walls in place, we'd probably tend to more stay away from them, only build there if we absolutely had to, rather than looking to build there as a safe space. And also when something does happen, we're overconfident in the wall's ability to protect us from that. And then we don't take the proper precautions to evacuate, to move to high ground, that we should take because of that sort of overconfidence in the wall's ability to kind of stave off disaster. So it sounds like there's sort of two pieces of this. One is we build more in those spaces, so there's more people there, and then also a sort of mental math that we do when we decide whether to stay or to flee. And we tend to flee less often if we have a wall that we think protects us.
Yes, I mean both those factors are going on, were going on in Japan, and clearly it is a big challenge. I mean, it highlights this problem that actually, governments would like to intervene to help prevent the consequences of disasters, but it's quite a difficult and subtle thing about, well, how do you intervene in ways which are guaranteed really to be successful, that don't have secondary consequences of some form. And there are many ways in which people do things. I'll give you another example of these sort of secondary complications. I mean, in a number of South American cities, there are areas of very steep land, or there are areas which are regularly flooded. So the city chooses not to build on them, but that means that informal settlements move in and occupy the land instead, and then the people in informal settlements are often they may be least well informed about the potential for disasters. They may be in buildings which themselves are very dangerous. You have situations in some South American cities where the government, to help the people who have these informal, unofficial shantytown buildings, that actually they help them by offering them bricks to build their houses with, because they're less likely to fall down in a rainstorm. But that actually means that they are loading up the potential for a really devastating future earthquake. I mean, of the kind that actually happened in Haiti. Again, the Haiti earthquake, the worst impacted sectors were these informal settlements where they'd built in ravines on the edge of the city in land which officially was considered unsuitable for building, but without the ability to police it, to prevent people building there, it simply meant that the poorest people made the most dangerous unofficial buildings in these specific high risk locations.
It does seem like there's this tension as well between who builds in some of these locations. In places like Haiti, as you say, if those areas are considered risky, then it tends to be the most at risk or disadvantaged people who choose to live there, perhaps because there's nowhere else for them they feel they can live. Whereas in parts of North America, for example, we have people building beach houses on beaches that get regularly flooded or impacted by storm surges, and those tend to be sometimes some of the wealthiest people that are building in those locations just for the prestige of it or for the ocean views that they get from their windows.
Yes, I mean so then we have, I would say, some issues, some contrasting issues about are people free to build in high risk locations, and do they expect the rest of the world, the rest of society to bail them out when things go wrong? And the question of the beach house is a good example of this in terms of it's hard to stop someone building a property in a location which you may know is high risk. I mean, these are perils like hurricane, storm surge, where there probably will be some warning. So this may not be a risk of loss of life, but it certainly will be a risk to their property. And do they expect the system to compensate them for the fact that they've chosen to live in a delightful but extremely dangerous location, and it is hard to generalize about this question. I mean, do we find situations where the poorest, where the most disadvantaged people end up in the highest risk locations? Because we see that. I mean, the situation in New Orleans, for example, was that the city had been flooded the previous time in 1965 in the aftermath of Hurricane Betsy, and people had learned then that the lowest parts of the city had the highest depths of floodwater, and it became almost impossible to sell those properties because the flooding had become so notorious that they were used just for rental. They were not improved at all, and so they tended to be, the people who lived there tended to be the old and the infirm and most at risk, least likely to evacuate. So there we have a situation, I mean, as with the barrios in South American cities, where the poorest people end up in the highest risk locations. But then you've got the other end of it, where you've got situations where the highest risk locations in Florida are right along the beachfront, and they are also going to be the most expensive locations too. So you have these sort of two ends of the spectrum who are by intent or by accident find themselves in the highest risk situations.
So I am interested to talk about insurance, because this was a big topic in the book, both the history of insurance, which I didn't know about, that was fascinating in its own right, but also some of the challenges the insurance industry faces when it comes to natural disasters, and who ends up kind of picking up the dime when an insurance company or the insurance industry can't cope with the amount of claims that come out of a major national disaster. So can you maybe give us a little flavor of some of the history of how insurance came to be? It's something that we all think about as just like a normal part of life now, but it's not actually that old.
Yes, I wanted to fold in this story of insurance into this, exactly because it is not very well known. It's probably not very well respected, and it's an important component of this story of our response to disasters. As important as the scientific knowledge that has been gained about what determines earthquakes or how do hurricanes actually move over the ocean. So insurance was founded in the late 17th century, in the 1680s or 90s, and the first insurers appeared. And they appeared in the aftermath of the Great Fire of London, which was in 1666. There are many ways of thinking about it where you can see that actually it provided the perfect environment for insurance to take off, because here you had they rebuilt the city of London out of brick and tile in place of the wood and thatch that existed before when the city burnt down. So they deliberately took action to really improve the standard of the buildings, and that meant that the level of risk in terms of the risk of your building being destroyed by fire was much lower than people typically appreciated. You had a situation where the fear of fire was actually much higher than the actual level of risk of fire, and that is the perfect environment, if you like, to actually set off insurance. It became possible to establish 2 or 3 insurance companies which actually would offer protection for a price. You pay a premium, and then in the event your building burns down, you'll get compensation for it, and this was the idea. It's a really interesting. It's quite a radical idea, and actually, and it worked. And these companies, some of these companies were still around 200 or 300 years later. Some of the original founding companies, and this, the idea is sort of still the same today. The idea of covering disasters first turned up at the very end of the 19th century, and then got going through the 20th century. That it was, the idea, again, this was a really radical idea that you could protect your building through insuring it against hurricane or earthquake, and that took off. And to start with, you can see the way it was being covered was actually pretty expensive, but actually no one knew what the true cost of risk should be. But it meant that insurers had to think about these ideas of the cost of risk. And that was really novel, and the apparatus they developed for thinking about risk required understanding the history of previous events in a given region. So if you were insuring a property in an island in the Caribbean, you'd want to know, well, how many earthquakes have we had over the previous 200 or 300 years? How many hurricanes? How likely was this building to get damaged? What was its vulnerability or its susceptibility to loss? So the basic framework, the basic way of thinking about how we break down this problem of understanding risk into its component pieces, which we consider the hazard, if you like, how often we expect the wind to be above some level, how often the shaking is above some threshold, and the exposure. So what is actually the nature of the building? How is it built? What is its roof constructed out of? And then what is the vulnerability, which is how much damage we can expect the building would be subject to at a given wind speed, at a given level of ground shaking. That idea sort of emerged out of insurance industry thinking around how to handle catastrophes through the middle part of the 20th century. And then what happened was that insurers and what are called reinsurance companies, and reinsurance companies simply insure insurers. If an insurer finds they have too much potential loss in one particular area, they will themselves buy insurance off a reinsurer. And reinsurers are very concerned with how they build up a book of business, how they build up business around the world to balance the potential for losses in one area with other areas which would not expect to be suffering losses at the same time. So this was progressing and expanding through the 60s and 70s and 80s, but it was increasingly coming increasingly finding itself in trouble, because the events that happened were not simply repeats of events which had happened in history. They were new to some degree, and some of these events, in particular, a couple of hurricanes in 1989, one called Hugo, one called Andrew in 1992, they caused such high losses that insurers started going out of business because they couldn't pay their claims, and there was a realization that actually you couldn't simply found a way of actually running catastrophe insurance by only looking at what had happened over the previous few decades. There had to be a better way of making sense of how to think about the risk.
We'll be back with more Science for the People right after this.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show and podcast that explores everyday life from a scientific perspective. We are a member of the Skeptic Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on science and critical thinking. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to support us at Patreon, to connect with us on Facebook and Twitter, and to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People. I'm Rochelle Saunders. Insurance policies, for anybody who's ever read one, and I'm sure many people have had the time in their life where they've had to purchase an insurance policy for a home, as tenant insurance, car insurance is another good example. Sometimes when you read the fine print, you realize that there's actually exclusions that can be built in, particularly focusing on some of these kind of natural disasters, floods, earthquakes, things like that. And I presume that in some situations those are there because the insurance company can't really calculate the risk or isn't able to take on that risk. But also, I'm also curious as to how that plays out once those kinds of disasters actually happen. It seems like insurance, in particular during a massive disaster or catastrophe, that gray zone becomes a lot less easy to defend from a PR standpoint.
Well, so yes, I mean, obviously, ideally, there's how insurance should work. The actuality is going to be a little messier in terms of reading the small print. I mean, there is now a recognition that this is a problem. That it is a problem that if you measure the impact of disasters, I mean, if you looked at the economic impact of disasters and you compare what is the economic cost as compared with how much has been paid by insurance is paying only a proportion, maybe 20 or 30% of the total loss, maybe more than that in some situations, some perils, and that is is not very satisfactory in terms of the utility of insurance, which is if it's working effectively, it can help people get back on their feet, get their lives back together as soon as possible after some loss has happened. And so there is currently a movement focused around trying to shrink what is called in slightly marketing terms the protection gap. So the protection gap is that which is not being picked up by insurance, and I mean it's a very interesting area, I think, and I mean if we look around the world at this protection gap, I mean the best situations are in countries where you have one kind of insurance which covers you for all the potential perils. So that's the situation that we find in the UK, we find it in France, we find it in some other European countries, and it's very there are not going to be significant exclusions that tell you're not covered against earthquake or flood, and the protection gap. So this gap as to what is not insured in such cases can be quite small, can be down to only 5 or 10% of the total loss. While at the other end we have situations like earthquake in California is perhaps the most notorious, where the proportion for the residential sector, the proportion that is covered by insurance is probably only 10 or 15% of the total cost of a disaster, and that clearly is really somewhat intolerable in terms of the function of insurance to help protect people in society.
I'm assuming a lot of the times when private insurance companies that exist either don't cover the damage or the losses or can't cover the damage or losses, that in a lot of situations governments step in order to help people recover from these kinds of things.
Yes, I mean governments step in. I mean this again is can be a challenge. I mean if you know the government's going to step in, then you won't buy insurance. And so I mean the situation we have in Italy is the example where almost no one, the take-up rate of if you want earthquake insurance or flood insurance as a homeowner in Italy, then you've got to buy it as a separate coverage, and almost no one bothers to buy it because they assume that the government will bail them out in a disaster, and typically the government has sort of more or less bailed people out in disasters, but actually it's not that is not a contractual arrangement. That is simply a tradition, and we know there are potential disasters in Italy, potential earthquakes in particular, which could be so large in terms of their losses that actually the government would be very stretched to actually compensate for everybody. So, but I mean, as long as the Italians assume that the government will step in, and Italians have been assuming this for the last 2,000 years, even in the Roman times, they sort of assumed that if you had a disaster, the government would step in. If that's what you believe, then actually you're not going to buy insurance.
I've also heard that there's some places in the U.S. where homes just keep getting rebuilt over and over and over after flood damage or storm surge damage, in part due to just there is no flood insurance that those people can buy, and they also can't move, so we just kind of cover them to get them back up to where they were and then wait for the next storm to hit.
Yeah. I mean, you have more politics around this. I mean, it's quite hard to separate catastrophes from politics, and you have the situation in the US where originally insurers were hit by an enormous flood event in 1927 on the Mississippi River, and it was so vast that the insurance industry said, actually, we're not going to cover flood anymore. It's simply the loss is too big, and it's totally is totally dependent on actually whether the government has built its flood defenses high enough or not, and so therefore we will exclude it. And then in the 1960s there were big floods in America, including this flooding of New Orleans in Hurricane Betsy in 1965. And the government then had to step in and actually set up a federal flood insurance program, which was administered by private insurers, but was ultimately a government scheme. And in order to get this started, in order to avoid a political backlash, they simply said to everybody who had a building already which existed in a defined flood zone, they just simply told them that actually they shouldn't worry. They would get a subsidized rate. They would get a cheap rate for their flood coverage, a rate which was less than the technical cost of the risk, and they shouldn't worry. And actually, and so it's being called, this system is called grandfathering, where any pre-existing building was giving subsidized risk costs, and those subsidized risk costs proved impossible to take away. And there was an attempt in 4 or 5 years ago to remove the subsidy, and there was such an outcry that the government had to reverse their decision on it. So there's sort of this was a consequence of the difficulty of trying to apply a system, apply some sort of insurance system where people may have had expectations that the state would anyway look after them, and in order to make this accepted, this ruling had to be made, which meant that the insurance system as a whole was never able to balance the books. I mean, and this National Flood Insurance Program in the U.S. has had to borrow somewhere around $20 billion off the government to pay its claims, simply because they were never accumulating enough premium, enough flood insurance costs to pay for all the potential losses.
So there's these sort of hidden subsidies at work that are making this problem in some areas really difficult to get out of. I mean, I guess the question is why don't the next time these places flood, we instead provide people with the money they need to relocate rather than rebuild?
Yes, I mean, you can try doing that, but actually many of them may not want to relocate, and the question is, are you going to force people to move at that point? I mean, are you going to take away their flood insurance? So we have the situation in the Bahamas, which is instructive because the Bahamas has very much the same climate as southern Florida, the same hurricanes, but has a completely different insurance system. It has a system where your insurance, your standard homeowner's insurance, covers both wind and flood, and it also has no government backstop. So if you can't get insurance, that's too bad as far as the situation concerned. So we have the situation at some communities, in particular one called Queens Cove on the northern shore of Grand Bahama, which is a canal estate. Is where canals have been cut and the land which has been dug out has been used to raise the ground, and then houses have been built on this raised ground. But the actual elevation of the properties is less than a meter above sea level, and these properties have flooded repeatedly and in storm surges from passing hurricanes, and to the point where actually the insurers said, well, you can't buy insurance here anymore. It's actually, the risk is too high. And that meant that without insurance you couldn't get a mortgage, and houses started to become abandoned. But on the edge of this area, or the area of abandoned properties, some people realize that if you raise the property up on concrete stilts as upper floor, then actually you could bring it back to being insured again, to getting a mortgage again, and I feel this story of actually what has been happening. It's instructive about what we can expect to be happening around sea level rise and as anticipated through warming, and a number of cities all around the world, but in particular on the U.S. East Coast, are faced with the recognition that actually the sea, the sea level is rising, that actually extreme water levels are becoming more common, and this is threatening the pre-existing property. And we have the whole challenge as to, is that going to be a government responsibility? Is it going to fall back on individuals? How is flood insurance going to function? Does flood insurance simply run out at some point when the risk gets too high? So a lot of places, a lot of coastal communities are going to be going through the same challenges on this issue, and it's being tested already in a number of locations along the U.S. coast. And I mean, Miami is a particularly interesting one because you can't simply build flood walls there, because the rock on which the city is built is so porous. The water comes through underground caves, if you like, and a wall, so it simply doesn't keep the water out. And we also have situation like southern Louisiana, south of New Orleans, where the land is sinking almost 3 times as fast as the sea level is rising. So as the experience of the water level rise from sea level is happening much faster than for typical cities around the world, and they are having to work out how to cope, when to relocate communities, when to try and build a flood defense, and all the time, in all these decisions which are being taken around the more ordinary flood events, we know sooner or later there's going to be a big hurricane and a big storm surge through southern Florida, just as we know there's going to be big storm surge events through southern Louisiana. And it's in these extreme events that all these decisions around flood walls or raising buildings, it's then that they're going to be tested. And we clearly don't want to discover, or we hope we won't discover another situation like that of Katrina, like that of the flood, the tsunami walls in Japan, where simply a decision had been taken about what level of protection to provide, but actually the level of protection was not adequate up against a particular catastrophic event.
One of the other things I wanted to talk about a little bit was the idea of mass evacuations, in particular for things like hurricanes coming in. Obviously, there are parts of the world that have built around volcanoes where that's a real risk, obviously an uncommon one around the world, but a real risk for certain types of communities, and how we make decisions about when to evacuate, how far ahead to evacuate, because evacuating a community is a challenge. Evacuating a huge city is, I can just imagine, a logistical nightmare to try and run that evacuation safely and make sure you provide enough time that people can get out safely and effectively before the disaster hits. But also, you don't want to evacuate people needlessly either.
Yeah, I mean, evacuation is clearly an appropriate response to certain kinds of disasters, the most challenging situation is around, as you identified, is around volcanic eruptions, it's why it's so challenging is that there is unlikely ever to be a dress rehearsal for this. It's going to happen for real. You are going to have somebody in charge of making decisions around evacuation who has almost certainly never done this before. These events are sufficiently infrequent that actually, almost certainly this will be the first time they've done it. It'll be hugely political, in that if you demand that a city like Naples next to the volcano Vesuvius, if you demand that it evacuates, that's gonna have a huge impact on the local economy, on manufacture, on supermarkets, on banks. Everything, and people are going to be very reluctant to do it. If you may evacuate people because you think there's signs the volcano is coming back to life, but you don't actually know when it's going to erupt. So you may evacuate people too early, and in which case they'll start drifting back again when nothing happens for a few days, and then they may be in the path of the event when it does happen. You may not evacuate people far enough. So how far away from volcano you're going to evacuate people is going to be a bit of a guess, and you may get it wrong. The eruption may be much bigger than you thought it was going to be. It's almost a no-win situation, and there's no. You could see, maybe there should be some international agency that is helping countries in this area, because they're going to find themselves, there is international expertise amongst volcanologists, but actually they're going to find themselves on their own when it comes to taking decisions. And, we have examples in the 20th century, have examples in the Caribbean of one eruption in the French territories in, I think, 1901, when the local governor on the island of Martinique, at the city of Saint-Pierre, the local governor just wanted to calm people down and told everybody, "Don't worry," and it's fine, we'll be safe. And then the whole city was destroyed by the eruption, and only one prisoner incarcerated deep in a dungeon survived. And you have that situation, and you have the opposite situation in the 1970s in the neighboring island of Guadeloupe, where a scientist demanded an evacuation took place, and I think more than 100,000 people did evacuate from a region of the island, and again caused a significant economic impact. And then there was no eruption at the end of it. The volcano shuddered a bit, some steam came out, and then it went back to its dormancy again. Everybody had to shuffle back. So it's really hard to think of how to manage this in a way which is going to be successful. And there hasn't been a significant volcano going off in an urbanized area at all since for 25 years now. So this is something which this is exactly the kind of disaster. It has not been it's not been on a high profile. It's not people are not thinking about it significantly. It's exactly the kind of disaster we can anticipate at some point in the not too distant future.
Volcanoes, I think, are interesting because they are so unpredictable and so difficult to gauge as to whether or not people should or shouldn't evacuate. But even things that we're a bit better at predicting, for example, hurricanes and storm surges, quite often when we do provide evacuation notices and require people to evacuate, there is definitely a non-trivial number of people who either can't evacuate under their own power, they have nowhere to go or aren't able or are mobile, or people who just refuse to leave. So there's that sort of extra bit in evacuation as well, where I think we overestimate our ability to weather the storm in a lot of those situations.
Yes. I mean, clearly it requires a lot of management and anticipation of how you're going to organize it, and every evacuation is going to be a little bit different as to which areas are going to be impacted. I mean, one particular problem I identify around evacuation is the crying wolf problem. I mean, the idea of crying wolf, of the boy who's looking after the sheep who just gets bored and who starts shouting out "wolf, wolf," and so the villagers turn up, and then they get bored. They get fed up with him, so they ignore his cries, and then eventually, when a wolf does turn up and he shouts "wolf, wolf," no one bothers to come and help. And the crying wolf problem is a significant one for evacuations, because we think that if you have an evacuation of a city and nothing happens, we think, well, that's good news, isn't it? But actually, it always has a pervasive impact on those who evacuated, because some proportion of them will simply say, well, actually, next time I won't bother because last time nothing happened. I mean, we had the situation in 2004, Hurricane Ivan hit the edge of New Orleans, and there was an evacuation of the city, but nothing happened. And so when Katrina came the following year, a number of people just ignored the warning, because the last time there had been the crying of wolf, and we have to measure the cost of the situation where you over evacuate people, in terms of actually how many lives will be lost in the future, or how many lives as a result of people who just won't evacuate because their last experience was nothing happened. So, that's part of the challenge of managing disasters, is to get that balance right, is to not start over evacuating people.
You do talk a little bit in the book about some places where they do have a good mix of policy and culture around certain disasters that they're more prone to. The Netherlands was one of the examples that you used, that they have a long history of having to deal with floods because of the way that they're structured and the way that they're built. And they've actually created and sort of built that into their culture and the way that they create policies around flooding. So can you talk a little bit about the Netherlands and how, from a lot of perspectives, they're a bit of a success story about getting a good mindset around disasters that can happen to your community?
Sure. So in looking around the world, in trying to find places where people have developed the appropriate cultural response to integrate the potential for disasters into how they live, how they function. If I was awarding the number one country, I think, for really integrating disaster management into their culture is the Netherlands, and this goes back to how effectively the country was created in a delta of the Rhine by actually cutting out channels to let the water drain, and actually creating new farmland. And right the way back to the 16th century, they were faced by big storm surge floods coming in from the North Sea. In a single night, they could lose thousands of hectares of land, and then would slowly try and recapture it again over the following decades. I mean, one part of their system was that they had a ruling that whoever land the flood can take, I mean, it was their job to protect it. So that you had to manage the flood defense that protected your land. And they had someone would come around called the dike count, whose job it was to check that your flood defense was in good condition, and to point out, where it was defective or too low or was eroding, and actually demand that you make improvements to it. And actually they would then come back a few months later, and actually, if you hadn't made the improvements, they could confiscate your land. If you wanted to get money to raise the defense, then they might be the only source of funds, and they would charge a high interest rate. So it was quite a punitive system, but it was very effective in it really, over time. And if you looked at the battle with storm surge floods, you could say that in the sort of 14th and 15th centuries, the Dutch were sort of losing land faster than they could reclaim it. But actually, by the 17th century, they'd really got on top of it. They created windmill-powered flood pumps and a whole system of where the management of the flood defenses was sort of everybody's problem. They didn't just have a small group of experts who were in charge of managing their disasters. It was everybody's function. The whole village. And they have stories of when the defense is breached, the whole village turns out. Everybody comes along. That some women are using their aprons to carry clay in to actually help put into the gap in the defense. So it was collectively owned. It was then the whole of sort of Dutch culture even today has emerged out of this flood management system, and for where it's everybody's problems, what they call polder culture, which is that everybody, you all have to work together to collectively surmount the threat of floods, and they really, they've done a fantastic job at this. I mean, they're now the Dutch are going around the world actually marketing their expertise at flood risk management in deltas into other delta regions around the world.
There's also been some successes in Chile on creating buildings to withstand earthquakes, because they're in a very earthquake-prone part of the world and have definitely had to learn how to create infrastructure that can withstand something that happens to them quite regularly.
Yes, I mean in Chile, if you look at sort of which if in terms of measuring danger as what is the chance you will be killed by an earthquake in different countries of the world through the 20th century, you find that at the start of the 20th century, Chile was one of the most dangerous countries because it was extremely earthquake afflicted. I mean, it's got a very, very active plate boundary running underneath it, and it's a very long, thin country, all of which is facing this plate boundary, and I mean, it's to some degree it's been helpful. I mean, as with the Netherlands experiencing floods so often, in Chile, the experience of earthquakes so often has meant that actually it absolutely needed to make the construction of buildings which were able to withstand earthquakes. It was such a priority, and they've created leading schools of engineering in identifying how they should do this. But in particular, they have a way of supervising construction, of sort of ensuring that it's checked at the point where the design is made as the point during the course of the building, and they impose very tough fines on any builder whose structure would fall down. As a result of an earthquake, can expect very significant fines or could be sent to jail. So they've got people to respect. The earthquakes happen so frequently, everybody respects that this is absolutely fundamental to the functioning of the society. You can't simply believe you're cutting corners, and that would be considered immoral to some degree. And they've got situations now where they had a huge earthquake. I mean, not almost the same size as this giant earthquake off the coast of Japan in 2011. They had an earthquake in 2010, and I know the casualty rate from that earthquake was less than an earthquake in Italy the previous year, which was about 1,000 times smaller in terms of its energy, and it's simply because they really have done a good job at actually mastering their construction. And here again we have it's owned collectively. I mean, the whole country is sort of proud of this fact. It's actually something that all those who commission buildings, those who build buildings, they sign up to.
I think both of these are great examples of how it's not just enough to know what to do. You also have to make sure and enforce that people do it, because these kinds of behaviors that create lax structures or that create lax dikes in terms of what's happened in the Netherlands, those are everybody's problem. It's not just one person's protection that fails. If a building falls down, it's not the builder that gets killed. It's the people who are in the building or the people who are around the building at the time. And I think both of these are really illustrative examples of how important it is to have the social impetus to really force people to do what we know is right? You can have building codes in place and you can factually know how to build a building to withstand an earthquake, but you also have to make sure that people don't cut the corners, that people actually build the buildings to code, which in a lot of parts of the world is as much the struggle as getting the right building codes in place.
Yes, no, I mean, it is absolutely the case. I mean, if you're looking at success in this area, it needs to be collectively owned, and people have to see that clearly there are sectors of the economy who resist some sense of supervision or someone coming along to check on them, and actually you have to create enough government, if you like, that it can actually manage this process effectively, and that because it's actually going to be to the benefit of everybody if you can succeed at it.
Robert, it's an excellent book, and it's been a really fascinating hour talking with you. Thank you so much for coming by the show.
Okay, thank you.
If you want to learn more about Robert Muir-Wood, his book, The Cure for Catastrophe, How We Can Stop Manufacturing Natural Disasters, or learn more about his ongoing work, we have links for you to click up on the show notes for this episode, which, as always, you can find on our website, scienceforthepeople.ca. Science for the People is produced by Rochelle Saunders and edited by Ryan Bromsgrove. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. We get research help from Josh Witten and consulting support from Desiree Schell. Our frequently seen guest hosts are Marion Kilgour, Anika Hazra, and Jessica Yaros. Our theme song is called Binary Consequence, and it was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern. Science for the People is entirely listener-supported. You can find us on Patreon, where you can support us with monthly donations in any amount, or you can send us a one-time donation in any amount via the donate page of our website. Science for the People is created in partnership with the Skeptic Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on the intersection of science, popular culture, politics, and social justice. You can find out more about Skeptic at skeptic.org. The show is hosted by science news writer Bethany Brookshire and me, Rochelle Saunders.